Hey there friends, my name is Jim, and today I'd like to talk to you about propaganda. In the last few years, the propaganda of the Western media cabal has ramped up from the average everyday programming of the past to a type of propaganda that's almost silly in its ridiculousness. This was seen for almost 2 years with COVID, every new statement from so-called experts contradicting the last without any acknowledgement that they'd ever been wrong in the first place. Advice from ostensibly intelligent doctors and public health authorities that were the antithesis of common sense, but when the thought that they could be wrong popped into your head, they made sure to continuously remind you that you were opposing the experts, and the type of science that they knew was so far beyond what your puny plebeian mind could comprehend that you wouldn't voice your concerns for fear of looking dumb. You remember the myriad of legitimate doctors who came out against the government agenda and were labeled quacks before subsequently losing their practice and all of their friends and family. Something as silly as wearing 3 masks was seen as legitimate, intelligent scientific debate, and if your gut told you different, you were the stupid one. Now that they have moved on from the pale horse of plague to the red horse of war, the propaganda machine has moved right along with them. And I'd like to show you some examples of how, when all of the West's media apparatus is in agreement about something, you can usually count on that thing being dead wrong. So before we begin, I want to remind you guys that this channel lives and dies on your word of mouth. YouTube is constantly attempting to keep the same narrative going as any other big tech companies, so please click the link to this video, copy it, send it to a friend. Like, share, subscribe, comment, and if you think what I do is actually valuable and you want to see more of it, feel free to check me out on Patreon, Locals, or my own website at jimmyjams.xyz, linked in the description below, and let's get into it. So for people who have seen some of my videos, you might recall the one I made a couple days ago showing the documents proving the biological weapons facilities in Ukraine both definitely exist and were funded by the United States Department of Defense. I think I remember saying that soon this story would be all over the place and that the Western cabal would do everything they could to shut it down. Well, that was like 2 days ago, and now the US government's in total panic mode attempting to get a lid on this before anyone starts to realize that what Vladimir Putin has been accusing the US of for the last decade was probably at least partially correct. Considering he was correct on that count, it probably behooves us to see what else he said in this domain, to see what other secrets may soon emerge from the hive of scum and villainy that is the US State Department in Ukraine. I mean, our government officials did kind of use that as their playground for all their funny money business, the Hunter Biden laptop stuff, all the weird jazz that goes on in Ukraine. Mitt Romney's kid, Nancy Pelosi's kid both have jobs lobbying in Ukraine for gas companies, so they definitely have a lot of shadowy stuff going on down there that they don't want to emerge, and that's probably why they're so against Putin going in there in the first place. So the refrain from Putin about the labs has been for years that the United States has been developing biological weapons in the Ukraine labs that have specific purpose of targeting the genes of the various Slavic ethnicities. To me that sounds pretty outlandish, but so would COVID had you told me about it in early 2019. And specifically, one of their other complaints, apparently that they just alleged over the last day, is that the United States and in Ukraine were actually the ones who developed SARS-CoV-2 in a lab. Now, apparently what they're saying is prior to the whole project being moved to the EcoHealth Alliance in Wuhan, China, they were developing the chimeric bat coronaviruses and doing the humanized lab tests, the humanized mice lung lab tests in Ukraine, and then they moved the whole product over into China. Now China's coming out and saying that we need a full audit of all of our biological laboratories all over the world. And first of all, China, fuck off. But second of all, you guys were kind of in on the US when we did it, so if anybody needs some, maybe we need to audit our stuff, but you probably do too, and neither of us are going to do it first, so kind of a moot point. But even if that is all an exaggeration by Putin to justify further military intervention in Ukraine, I don't see how it isn't something that's worth a further scrutiny, considering we lied and continue to lie about their existence. The last 2 weeks have been full of so-called fact-checkers poo-pooing the claim of US-funded biolabs in Ukraine, which raises the question of how they would know. I mean, I was under the impression that the US government is unreliable, and a journalist's job is to find out if the narrative they're peddling to you is actually true or not. But these headlines show yet again the media is playing errand boy for the Biden administration, making sure that they follow their lead and don't say anything that could upset the carefully crafted story that's been inserted into the zeitgeist. Jen Psaki, the press secretary, was so upset with this awful Russian disinformation that she made an 8-tweet thread about how they definitely don't exist. So let's take a look at that real quick. So here's Jen Psaki at PressSec of the United States government official. Quote, "We took note of Russia's false claims about alleged US biological weapons labs and chemical weapons development in Ukraine. We've also seen Chinese officials echo these conspiracy theories. This is preposterous. It's the kind of disinformation operation we've seen repeatedly from the Russians over the years in Ukraine and in the other countries which have been debunked, and an example of the types of false pretexts we have been warning the Russians would invent. The United States is in full compliance with its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Biological Weapons Convention and does not develop or possess such weapons anywhere. It's Russia that has a long and well-documented track record of using chemical weapons, including in attempted assassinations and poisoning of Putin's political enemies like Alexei Navalny. Now, that's true. Very, very fair point. The last tweet wasn't true, but that one's true. It's Russia that continues to support the Assad regime in Syria, which has repeatedly used chemical weapons. I would like to point out, that has also never been proven, and it's actually been pretty well verified that that never happened, and it was specifically a false flag planned by the United States to take Assad out of power. Whole other video about that eventually. Back to Jen Psaki, quote, "It's Russia that has long maintained a biological weapons program in violation of international law. Also, Russia has a track record of accusing the West of the very violations that Russia itself is perpetrating. In December, Russia falsely accused the US of deploying contractors with chemical weapons in Ukraine." You're gonna have to look into that one, because that's the thing that I'm saying. Journalists just believe what our government says and disbelieve what the other governments say because our government has such a great track record of perfect truth. Because, yeah, the CIA did this horrible stuff in the 50s, and the 60s, and the 70s, and the 80s, and in the 90s, and in the early 2000s, but like in the mid to late 2010s, they stopped, and they definitely haven't been doing anything else, and in 20 years, FOIA, documents aren't going to come out showing some horrible, horrible experiments they're doing now or anything. Back to Jen Psaki, her last two tweets. "This is all an obvious ploy by Russia to try to justify its further premeditated, unprovoked, and unjustified attack on Ukraine. Now that Russia has made these false claims, and China has seemingly endorsed this propaganda, we should all be on the lookout for Russia to possibly use chemical or biological weapons in Ukraine, or to create a false flag operation using them. It's a clear pattern." So, I suppose that's what you can get from our press secretary. It's specifically interesting that in that she didn't actually really say, she did say that we don't possess any of these weapons, but she never said that US did not help Ukraine, fund Ukraine to develop and hold these weapons with our military in those biolabs. She just said that we are in full accordance with the full compliance with its obligations under the Chemical Weapons Convention and the Biological Weapons Convention. So, I suppose that as long as we are doing all this stuff in the Ukraine labs under the rules that we wrote, then it's all fine. But Russia can't, because we wrote the rules, and we wrote that they can't do it. This narrative is particularly easy to break down because it's impossible to square, and therefore makes a pretty good example of the stupidly obvious propaganda that I was talking about earlier. In the last couple of weeks, it went from the media saying that the biolabs don't exist, to Victoria Nuland saying that they do, and how we need to be sure they don't fall into Russian hands because they would be the only ones evil enough to ever use them, which begs the question why Ukraine was making them. Then, Jen Psaki going on that massive rant where she implies but never explicitly states that the biolabs aren't real, to Jennifer Griffin telling Sean Hannity, I think last night, that they were old Soviet biolabs we were cleaning, which kind of contradicts both of these ideas, and is contradicted by the leaked documents calling them veterinary research clinics in a couple of instances. Luckily enough, as I think I've said in the last 3 videos, these stupid fucking boomers keep forgetting that once something's on the internet, it never goes away. Case in point, this article by Natalie Winters at the National Pulse was able to find some deleted articles outlining the Obama-Biden State Department openly funding these labs, so let's take a look at that real quick. The National Pulse, again, by, what was her name, Natalie Winters. U.S. funds Ukrainian former bioweapons facility handling, quote, dangerous materials with windows wide open. The lab scientists said they work without Western-style safety equipment. A Ukrainian biolab receiving funds from the U.S. government was formerly a bioweapons factory under the control of the Soviet Union, with experts recently reporting a, quote, lack of modern biosafety equipment, as well as, quote, lethal microbes that in the West would be locked away in high-containment laboratories, unquote, said the National Pulse can reveal. An article published by the Washington Post on August 30th, 2005, quote, titled, U.S. to aid Ukraine in countering bioweapons reveals a lab now receiving U.S. government funds formerly, quote, supplied highly lethal pathogens to Soviet bioweapons factories, unquote. And it goes on to, quote, again. One lab to receive fundings is the I.I. Mekhanov Anti-Plague Scientific and Research Institute in the Black Sea port city of Odessa. This institute was part of a Cold War network of anti-plague stations that supplied highly lethal pathogens to Soviet bioweapons facilities. In 2008, researchers from the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies in Monterey, California, noted of the Mechnikov facility, I'm sorry, I'm bad with Slavic words and names. Quote, its management claimed in 2003 that it knew nothing about either the Soviet offensive or defensive bioweapons program. We question the second, since it was in effect a closed facility until the late 1980s and worked on highly dangerous Group 2 pathogens, and probably, at least at time, on some Group 1 pathogens since at least 1965. It would make sense if at least one of its laboratories worked on Problem 5 projects, and this is going through the different scale of what they consider the classes of dangerous pathogens. Problem 5 was the code name given to the Soviet bioweapons program. There you go. Another report by the James Martin Center revealed disturbing practices at the U.S.-funded facility, emphasis added. This is quoting the James Martin Center. The lack of modern biosafety equipment is also raising concern among U.S. officials about the potential for accidental release of deadly bacteria and viruses. In Odessa, where 44 scientists and about 140 support staff carry out research in the I.I. Mechnikov Anti-Plague Scientific and Research Institute, scientists wearing cotton smocks and surgical masks work with lethal microbes that in the West would be locked away in high-containment laboratories and handled only by scientists in spacesuits. Sus. The lab scientists said their training in handling dangerous materials allowed them to work safely with pathogens without Western-style safety equipment. Which they viewed as unnecessary and which in any case they cannot afford. Many of the institutes are located in downtown areas and some work with pathogens with windows wide open, said Sonia Ben-Orgram, who co-authored the Monterey study with Zelinskas and Alexander Melikishvili, whatever. You can read it there. This is this name, this one, Alexander. The news following the Biden State Department official Victoria Nuland telling the U.S. Senate that the American government is concerned about the biological research facilities falling into Russian hands as a result of the ongoing conflict in Eastern Europe, despite the department appearing to correct her testimony the following day. The Unearthed article also confirms a previous National Pulse report revealing how former President Barack Obama spearheaded negotiations leading to the lab eventually receiving U.S. government funds as part of a memorandum of understanding with the U.S. Department of Defense. Quote, the agreement, the result of more than a year of negotiations, was announced by Senators Richard G. Lugar, Republican from Indiana, and Barack Obama, Democrat from Illinois, during a visit to the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, notes the Washington Post. A separate article from the Irish Times, quote, Odessa Labs holds deadly legacy, unquote, explains the Odessa-based laboratory's former connections to the Soviet Union's biological weapons program. Dubbed a repository of knowledge, equipment, and lethal pathogens that could be useful to bioterrorists, the lab Obama negotiated to receive U.S. funds was highlighted for its inadequate safety precautions. The institutes were not officially part of the Soviet bioweapons complex, so they have been ineligible for the tens of millions of dollars given to each year by Western governments to keep up former weapons scientists from selling their expertise. These governments are just beginning to look for ways to help the institutes, and not only because of the bioterrorism threat. In a 2-year study of Russia's biotech industry, a panel of U.S. National Academy of Sciences recently urged former Soviet republics to modernize the anti-plague labs and integrate them with other global networks to prevent pandemics, added the article. So, more unearthed information about articles that have been deleted specifically in order to change the narrative more towards what Jen Psaki was saying in her ridiculous rant of a tweet. Sloppy job there, guys. Seriously. But this is far from the first time this administration has shown it doesn't mind controlling the information supply. If you don't know, it recently came out that the Biden admin was paying multiple major news outlets to push positive reporting on the vaccine, while they were also being paid by Big Pharma to do the same, which is another example of the lucrative merger of corporate and state that define the idea of Mussolini's fascism. Maybe you didn't hear that story. I can't imagine why. So, again, from Chris Pandolfo at The Blaze. Exclusive. The federal government paid hundreds of media companies to advertise the COVID-19 vaccines, while those same outlets provided positive coverage of the vaccines. In response to a Freedom of Information Act request filed by The Blaze, HHS revealed that it purchased advertising from major news networks including ABC, CBS, and NBC, as well as cable TV news stations Fox News, CNN, and MSNBC. Legacy media publications including the New York Post, the Los Angeles Times, and the Washington Post, digital media companies like BuzzFeed News and Newsmax, and hundreds of local newspapers and TV stations. These outlets were collectively responsible for publishing countless articles and video segments regarding the vaccine that were nearly uniformly positive about the vaccine in terms of both its efficacy and safety. Hundreds of news organizations were paid by the federal government to advertise for the vaccines as part of a, quote, comprehensive media campaign, according to the documents The Blaze obtained from the Department of Health and Human Services. The Biden administration purchased ads on TV, radio, in print, and on social media to build vaccine confidence, timing this effort with the increasing availability of the vaccines. The government also relied on earned media featuring, quote, influencers from, quote, communities hit hard by COVID-19 and experts like White House Chief Medical Advisor Dr. Anthony Fauci, and other academics to be interviewed and promote vaccination in the news. So again, it's just more of the same. It's obviously a prime example of what I'm talking about. The media has gone from the fourth column to just another branch of the Democratic Party. And don't worry, I'm not just jumping on the Democrats. The Republicans are absolute garbage too, and they're absolutely in bed with the same media corporations as the Democrats. It's just that the Republicans just do it because they're pussies and they have no principles. They are the Washington Generals to the Democrats' Harlem Globetrotters. They're just there to pretend that they're doing defense, while the Globetrotters do these crazy spin moves in front of the audience. And, the Washington Generals kind of stand like they're trying to stop it, but they're not really trying to stop it. But it's mostly because they want positive news coverage because they're scared of the New York Times, whereas people like Nancy Pelosi actively tell them what to do.
Do you think you need to do a better job at messaging, and going forward, how do you sell this if ultimately you have to?
Well, I think you all could do a better job of selling it, to be very frank with you, because every time I come here, I go through the list. Family and medical leave, climate, the issues that are in there. And but it is true, it is hard to break through when you have such a comprehensive package.
And of course she's right. As she said, the media could always do a better job of selling the agenda of the people who claim themselves your betters. Unfortunately, liberals and conservatives alike both knew this before the age of Donald Trump. But for half the country, the media being against him was good enough to give them their implicit trust forever, apparently. Some people who are genuinely good at breaking down these political types of things from a lefty perspective have fallen into the role of media amplifier for the regime that they would have protested against just a few years ago. The left of the past was a bunch of hippies on a farm complaining about how the government was forcing all of them to use genetically modified organisms in their crops and how dangerous it was to genetically alter food without knowing what that would do to us long term. Remember the Monsanto protest? Remember Roundup? Remember glyphosate? These days, those same people, those literally the same individual humans, are willing to force you to become a genetically modified organism. And if you think there are any dangers in that, you're a far-right neo-Nazi who doesn't understand science or care about grandma. The level to which so many people have been co-opted is representative of how many people actually think for themselves versus the people who just liked jumping onto the latest fad that sounded cool. The machine is totally okay with a small fringe of people protesting against GMOs in food because it gives them the feeling that they're in control. But when they need you to change your mind for the global corporate machine, they shift lockstep without giving it a single thought. It actually brought to mind to me a quote from Robin Williams' character when he guest starred in Law & Order SVU. You see, he was a man whose wife was killed by a medical malpractice, and as revenge he would push people as far as they could go, claiming to be an authority figure, to see if they would blindly believe his authority enough to commit horrible crimes on their fellow man. I couldn't find the clip, and it would probably get me struck for copyright because all the channels that had it were taken down, but I really want to leave you with his quote from that episode. So, quote, "But we're all in danger of being sheep, blindly following the herd, never questioning authority. It was the great American poet, Wendell Berry, who said it best when he was describing the perils of bowing at the altar of conformity. Your mind will be punched in a card and put away in a little drawer. And when they want you to buy something, they will call you. When they want you to die for profit, they will let you know. So friends, each day, do something that doesn't compute." Peace.